Hi out there, my name is Dax-Devlon Ross, and I am the author of Letters to My White Male Friends. I was inspired to write the book because I wrote a letter last summer. Really was a letter just to my friends of a certain age, my white male friends of a certain age. And it was a letter that I was writing. I wrote because a number of them reached out to me in the wake of George Floyd's murder to see how I was doing. And I appreciated that. And I thought as I was listening to them and experiencing those conversations that I was curious about how are they doing? Because it is important that they're checking on me as a Black man, but I'm also wanting to check in on them because I wanted to understand and hear from them, how are you experiencing this moment? It's one thing to be concerned with me, and I definitely valued and appreciate that, but this didn't just happen to a Black man, it happened to a man, a human being in America. Why don't you connect with that? Why do you not feel something about that? And I wanted to investigate that more. And of course, the essay was the first thing. And then I should just point out that unbeknownst to me and without any sort of promotion on my behalf, the letter started to just move around the country and then around the world. And people I had never met before, didn't know, were reaching out, white men, and just started wanting to have a conversation or just wanting to offer their reflections or just really appreciating the way that the letter landed with them. And a lot of them said that they felt as though they were invited into a conversation. It wasn't about a shaming. It was more of as a friend to a friend. I'm gonna explore some things with you as a Black friend of yours who's known you all your life, as you know me all mine, about some of the things that maybe we've never talked about that we need to talk about. And to your point, to your question specifically about, what are some of the things that need to be interrogated and reimagined? I talk about a few of them in the book, obviously, and there's some specific things that I think are important to consider. I think ones that are really, really important, of course, there you could talk about the criminal justice system and why crime happens, how crime happens, and who is often criminalized. That's, I think, part of our normal conversation at this point. We're talking about those kinds of things. But I want to interrogate other things as well. I think we have some systems that we've built around, for instance, even issues relative to inclusion in the workplace. We often think that, we just need to create new pipelines and create a new pipeline to bring in Black talent. Well, I submit that Black talent exists, and it has existed for a long time. I think that we create this myth that talent does not exist and that there's a limited supply of talent, a limited supply of people who can do certain jobs. And of course, there is expertise needed and there are skills required. But there's a reality that we often make an assumption that particularly Black people are incapable of performing certain roles. And that leads us to believing that we need to provide some kind of, opportunity through a quote unquote pipeline in order to provide those opportunities. So I just want to disabuse us of some of those myths that exist in our society. I think other ones that exist, of course, are even that all Black people that you encounter are not themselves members of, or at least have been the recipients of opportunity. I talk about very explicitly in this book, and I want to name the fact that I grew up middle class, which isn't to say I grew up rich, but I grew up in a household with opportunity. I was able to go to at least one of the most renowned sort of middle school, high schools in this DC area, and if not the country. So I had opportunity. And I know that, a lot of my colleagues, friends have had opportunity, but at the same time, I'm still approached, and the assumption still often is that all of us have never had access to opportunity, which isn't to say that I am better because I'm not, I know I'm not. It's to say that we have certain narratives about opportunity, certain narratives about access, certain narratives about success that just aren't really accurate and don't really reflect the accuracy of our experience in America. So just to offer, I think one more that's really, I talk about in the book, it's, I use these frames to kind of explore the ways in which I think how we interact with racism harms white people, because I do want us to sort of begin to turn the gaze, turn the lens and sort of look at a different way. Because often when we talk about race in America, we assume that we mean Black people or people of color. And I'd submit, and I think others do as well, that racialization happens to all of us, and that to be white in our society is also to be racialized. And so therefore, quite often we assume that the norms that we have in our workplaces, the norms that we have in our sort of broader in sort of industrial sectors, those are norms that everyone should just ascribe to, and that everyone has been sort of, will want to assimilate into, without taking into consideration those norms. They come from a place. They've been defined by certain attitudes and beliefs. And what we're asking for when we're trying to create more inclusive workplaces or communities and what else have you is not just that we can be represented in those places, but that folks have a voice and a say in the creation of those spaces. And so the assumption sometimes is just that people want to get a job or be invited into the industry. I think it's broader than that. I know it's broader than that. Folks want to have an opportunity to have some say-so in how that thing looks, how it feels, what the norms are. And that's different. And that requires people to do different kinds of reflection and open up more space than they maybe have traditionally done in the past. In the book, I talk about, because part of what I'm doing in the book is I'm mapping my own experience growing up as I identify as a member of Generation X. We're this cohort that's often forgotten when we have these conversations about generations. We talk about the millennials, we talk about boomers, we talk about we don't talk about X's. For some reason, we just kind of get forgotten. But in reality is we're the first generation that comes out of the civil rights movement. And what that means is that many of us experienced an education that sought to transcend race. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, when I was in school, that meant that the aspiration that many people, particularly white people, had was to be colorblind, to not see race. And so what I often encounter is people saying to me that they don't see it, that they just see everybody as the same. And that's all well and good, but, and of course we do, we know now from the Human Genome Project that we share the same DNA, but that doesn't mean there aren't social realities that we have to contend with in this society. And those social realities are linked to how we present in the world. So I present in a way that means that people have assumptions and treat me in a way. And I actually value my identity and I want to be seen as that identity. So to say you are colorblind, in my view, is A, offensive, but B, it also belies the truth of our experience in the country. Our aspiration is ultimately to get to a place where maybe these things do not matter, to the extent that they don't prevent one from having opportunity. They might not mean one will be sort of, it might not be a more of a propensity for them to be identified as a threat to society. Of course, those are aspirations, but I don't think the aspiration that people have, particularly people of color have, and specifically Black folks have, is to be deraced. I think people enjoy, embrace, and celebrate their racial identity. And that isn't to exclude others, but it is to say that we folks find value and believe and benefit in being able to claim part of a community that has an ancestry, a legacy, a story. So the colorblind aspiration, while well-intended, can often overlook, minimize, and delegitimize the actual experiences that people have and want to hold and want to be able to move through the world with. So, one of the things I have the benefit of doing is working at the intersection of equity and justice and inclusion in my work. So in addition to being a writer, I also work with organizations, I work with companies. I have the benefit of being able to talk to leaders, talk to staff, and just to help folks think about what they want to shift in order to create the reality that they want to create. And I think what I'm seeing is that there's a tremendous amount of allyship that people aspire for and want to be able to sort of usher into their places of business and their workplaces. But I think some of the barriers go back to things that I've already mentioned, which are that you can't necessarily be the one that defines what that looks like. You need to actually be able to create space for folks to determine, to define, and then be able to actually negotiate the things that they want. So allyship means a lot of things. We all know, we talk about it being a verb. It's not a noun. It's not something you do. It's something you are. It's something you show up as. It's not something you are. It's something you do. And it means that you also sometimes have to ask people what it is they need. And then create the space for them to be able to determine the things that they want. And I think sometimes it gets hard for folks who have power, who've experienced having power, just to be able to step aside and be able to say, I'm going to listen, I'm going to hear, and then I'm going to follow, and trust that the folks who are telling me what they want and what they need and what is going to help them be able to be successful here, and just trust them that that's going to lead to all of us being able to have a better experience in the workplace. So allyship, we need it. I value it. I know that it's an important part of the equation. I think it's just a recognition that it requires some discomfort sometimes, meaning you might have to actually feel a little bit of the discomfort of having to share something that you maybe haven't had to share, do something you haven't had to do, listen to people you haven't listened to, follow folks you haven't listened to, haven't wanted to follow, or haven't thought that you needed to follow. And that takes a little work sometimes. And it may not be as easy as just saying, I'm an ally. That requires some actual adjustments to your behavior and to your actions. So those are the things that I would suggest. You know, I feel like in many ways my book is in conversation with some of the people that I grew up, you know, admiring and finding a lot of encouragement in, and finding a lot of insight from. So I talk, you know, I was really fortunate to get an endorsement from Beverly Daniel Tatum, whose book, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Lunchroom, I think continues to endure as a very important text. And I encourage people, if you haven't read it in a long time, go back, just check it out, because I think it still holds value, still holds merit. There's some new books though. You know, I'm actually just started reading myself on Juneteenth, which is a powerful text, a short text, but a lot of us are in the midst of exploring the celebration of Juneteenth. And I think it's important to recognize that, of course, it originates in Texas, and I'm very proud to say that that one of my ancestors actually, at the end of the war, when he found out that he had been liberated, actually walked from Texas back to Virginia. So that's something that I claim as a part of my own personal legacy. But I think what that book is also important, and I've only gotten about halfway through myself, is that we need to be mindful of the fact that the folks, these folks who were enslaved in Texas, who were liberated through Juneteenth, had already been liberated by the Emancipation Proclamation, in that there was resistance and denial and disbelief and an unwillingness to change on behalf of the slaveholders in Texas. And so as we think about even the resistance that we continue to see to anti-racist work, the resistance that we see to anti-racist education, the resistance we see to the truth that people are trying to tell, that's part of a legacy too. It's a legacy of resistance of truth, or at least the truth that folks don't want to expose themselves to. So I invite people to look at that book. And then I think there's a new book that just came out a couple of days ago called The Second. And I read about it on NPR, and I haven't even gotten my hands on it, but I read a few reviews, and I read the sampling of it. But just the book traces the connections between the Second Amendment and the need for the states to be able to arm their citizens in case of slave revolts. So once again, we see threads and connections that people don't want to talk about between our founding documents and racial oppression. And I think it's really important that we just continue to allow ourselves to investigate that past without feeling as though it's going to ameliorate our identity. I think it enriches our identity. I think it gives us more of a sense of who we are when we allow ourselves to understand that in so many ways, the continuous oppression of Black people, but not just Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, of women, people who were not white, slaveholding, and land-owning men, that was part of our legacy. And that is not who we are now, but it is a part of our story, and it continues to permeate many of the documents that guide the decisions that get made in the Supreme Court, that guide policies that are created, that have an impact on people's lives. So I would invite folks to do some investigation around those books. And then I would say, there's some oldie but goodies. Another oldie but goodie is, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. With all the talk around critical race theory and all of the, the hemming and hawing and the hand wringing that people are doing around the threat that it seems to pose to young students, which I find to be really hypocritical and problematic, in large part because people didn't seem to have a problem for however many years of, young students of color, Black folks not being able to be taught any history about themselves. No one had a problem with that. But I would say, go back and read Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. That was a founding text. He was one of the people who really helped to develop the important ideas that continue to help guide us as a country to do the kind of work that we need to do. So those would be three. There are so many, many more. There's more that are out right now that I think I just would be sort of remiss to and for me to try to name them all wouldn't be fair, would be unfair to others. I just would say, just encourage people, not only read new books. So of course I want you to read mine. I want you to go pick up mine, but also continue to go back to the old texts, because those old texts have been telling us a lot of the same things that we're relearning today. None of this stuff is really new. We're just having to have the same conversation again and again and again. And just to put one last plug in my book, that's something I try to share about my experience growing up, was that I remember in the 1990s going through a period when the conversation was so heavily weighted around affirmative action, when we saw a very similar kind of sentiment that was being proliferated through many of the sort of right-wing think tanks that people don't necessarily know about or name. But those right-wing think tanks have a really, really powerful a narrative building infrastructure around creating sort of anti-Black ideology and getting it out into the world in such a way that it activates white people who maybe haven't done the work of really understanding how privilege operates, what the ultimate aims and aspirations of movements for change and for equity are all about. And I just hope that folks think that and recognize that this is, for me at least, what I'm up to is about empathy. And I think that empathy only happens when you begin to understand how our stories are linked, our histories are linked, and that we begin to see that we share a lot more, we have a lot more in common than we knew. So as who I'm speaking to is white men in my book, of course. And that's because I grew up with a lot of white men, and I have a lot of white men in my life who are my friends. And I feel like I have an ability to connect with them, and then they can connect with me. And so that we can open the space to begin to do work together. So that's what I would offer. And I appreciate the time and the opportunity to be in conversation with y'all.